Jackie at Stitchhouse. I'm back again with Fun Friday Facts. I want to talk to you, as I promised a couple of months ago, about how to get the best straight stitch. And I know some of you get frustrated by a straight stitch that appears to be somewhat crooked. So let's talk about why that can happen and what you can do to improve your straight stitch. First of all, if you can pretend with me that this cute check fabric is actually woven with big threads like this one right here. So there's thread there, and there's a thread there, and there's a thread there, and then woven the other way are threads. So don't think of this as a check, but as a piece of fabric made out of big threads. And that allows me to bring into play my big needle again. And you know how I love to use and show you my big needle. All right, so we're using our big needle to show how the stitch is taken. And generally, the needle hits between two threads if you're sewing perfectly on grain. And so the next stitch happens between two threads, and the stitch is nice and straight. Oh, don't roll there. You've got to show how straight you are. Okay, and then another stitch happens. But unfortunately, you're not always sewing on grain. So let's look over here on the other side, and our grain is off a little bit. And so your first stitch may occur here, and the next stitch, to be straight, may need to go in the middle of a thread. Needle tends to take the point of least resistance, so the needle probably will push that thread to one side or the other and go in between two threads. And at that point, you get a stitch that's a little bit crooked. Not a lot of control over that. The next stitch may need to go right here, and that one might work out just fine, but it's probably in the middle of a thread, so it may come back the other way. And before long, you've got stitches that just don't look the way you want your straight stitches to look. Now, if you're using a longer straight stitch, that irregularity won't look as pronounced because of the longer length to the angle, but it's still there. Now, you say, well, that's just fine and dandy, but I've sewn on a machine that gave me a perfect straight stitch. And I have two. My very first machine was a straight stitch only machine. A lot of you are sewing on featherweight machines, and you love the straight stitch that is on this featherweight machine. It's a straight stitch only. So what about a straight stitch only machine gives you a better stitch? First of all, it's the design of the presser foot. There's just a little needle opening here. It's not a wide opening like you find on your modern machines. In addition, the stitch plate has just a little tiny hole. So with that type of setup, the fabric can't shift. When the needle comes down on top of a thread, the needle will probably penetrate that thread and give you a better straight stitch, a truer straight stitch. So straight stitch equipment gives you a better straight stitch. So let's look at the evolution of the stitch plate, and actually the presser foot too. We started with a straight stitch needle opening on the stitch plate and a foot that had just a narrow opening on it. Then when zigzag machines were introduced, the needle opening had to be made wider to accommodate a zigzag stitch. The first zigzag machine that I remember had a 4mm zigzag, and so the stitch plate was wide enough to accommodate that 4mm stitch. At the same time, the needle opening on the presser foot had to be widened up to accommodate that wider stitch, the swing of the needle from side to side. Next, we started seeing needle or zigzags that would sew 5.5mm wider, and so the needle opening for the presser foot and the stitch plate had to be wider. And then we started seeing 7mm zigzag stitches, and then finally we have almost all of our machines are 9mm, and so the big needle opening on the 7 and the 9mm and a presser foot that will accommodate that same needle opening means that there's room in here for the fabric to wobble, and wobble it will do. So in this big opening that's not held down, that's not holding the fabric down like our straight stitch plate and presser foot did, the fabric tends to shift more. And so when the fabric shifts more, the thread sews at an angle. So how can you get the very best straight stitch? Come back and use a stitch plate that has just a single hole in it for a straight stitch, and a presser foot that has just a narrow opening for a straight stitch. Just having the presser foot will help some. Improve your straight stitch even more by using a stitch plate that has a single hole in it for a straight stitch. Let's look at this picture of, here's the presser feet opening, wide enough for the first zigzag, wider still as the zigzag became wider, more room for the fabric to move because the presser foot is not holding the fabric down flat like it did on our straight stitch machines with a straight stitch foot and a straight stitch needle opening on the stitch plate. Does that make sense to you? It's pretty straightforward, and it does make sense, I think. Now, let me tell you one more thing. If you want the very worst straight stitch that you can sew on your machine, this is the presser foot that you could use. This is a presser foot that's completely open in front of the needle. There's lots of play in the fabric here, and the stitch will wobble and look just as ugly as you can want it to look, okay? This is the worst presser foot to use for a good straight stitch. All right, let us know if you've sewn on a straight stitch machine before, comment, and now that you know why that straight stitch machine did a better stitch, tell us what you think about that. Thank you, good to see you again.